She risked her life to save a wild horse on the brink of death. When he returned 2 years later, a miracle happened before her very eyes. A moving story of interspecies connection, animal gratitude, and the power of kindness that transcends barriers. Prepare for tears of emotion. This story will change how you see the invisible bonds that connect us to wild nature. Hit like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. What does it truly mean to be part of nature? Are we mere observers of this grand spectacle, or protagonists in a story that transcends our understanding? At some point in life, we all wonder about our true place in this world. For a photographer in the heart of the American West's Whispering River Basin, this answer would arrive in the most unexpected way possible. Fog hung over the waters like a mysterious veil, transforming the landscape into an ethereal painting of grays and silvers. It was one of those mornings where time seems to suspend its normal course, inviting contemplation of the secrets nature guards so zealously. For Sarah, it was just another workday in the vast open-air laboratory she had chosen as her office. At 35, with over 15 years dedicated to nature photography, she thought she knew every nuance of wild behavior, every whisper the wind carried across the flooded plains of the Whispering River Basin. Raised among buildings and asphalt, she had always felt an inexplicable pull towards open spaces, places where the horizon met no artificial obstacles. There was something in her spirit that had never settled into urban conventions. The previous night's storm had completely transformed the landscape. What were once green fields had now become an endless mirror of water, reflecting heavy clouds that still threatened more rain. The river, usually so gentle and predictable, now roared with an ancient fury, dragging branches, logs, and shattered dreams in its current. Sarah carefully positioned her tripod on the small rise she had found, one of the few spots remaining dry after the devastating flood. Her experienced, precise fingers adjusted the focus of the telephoto lens, while her eyes scanned the liquid vastness before her, searching for that perfect moment, that split second that would justify all the hours of patient waiting. That's when she saw him. A desperate movement against the relentless logic of the current, a powerful black silhouette struggling in the turbulent waters, fighting with all its might against what seemed an inevitable fate. A wild horse, majestic in its vulnerability, had been swept into the center of the river and was now waging an uneven battle for survival. What happened next wasn't the result of rational calculation or an elaborate plan. It was pure instinct. Sarah dropped her professional camera, incredibly expensive equipment she had saved for years to buy, and without a second's hesitation plunged into the churning waters. The shock of the icy water almost paralyzed her muscles, but something inside burned intensely enough to keep her body moving. "Hang on, I'm coming!" Her words were swallowed by the roar of the water, but her arms cut through the current with superhuman determination. Each stroke was a declaration of war against time, against the odds, against the idea of being just a passive observer of the tragedy unfolding before her. The animal's eyes, deep and expressive, reflected the pure terror only truly wild creatures can convey. It wasn't just the fear of death. It was the primal dread of losing freedom, of having its existence cut short not by natural predators, but by the unpredictable fury of the elements. When she finally reached the horse, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and both would be dragged into the deadly embrace of the deep waters. Carefully, she positioned herself beside the exhausted animal, whose flared nostrils desperately sought air. "Trust me," she whispered, knowing it wasn't the words but the energy she conveyed that would make the difference in that critical moment. She guided the horse slowly, swimming beside him, offering her own body as support and direction. The bank seemed impossibly far, an almost unattainable goal given the exhaustion already beginning to dominate her limbs. But there was something in the animal's gaze, something beyond the initial desperation that now reflected an unexpected connection, fueling her determination. Minutes turned into an eternity as the unlikely pair battled the current. Her hands, now numb from the cold, clung to the black horse's wet mane, creating a physical bond that translated a much deeper commitment. "I won't leave you," she repeated between ragged breaths, like a mantra keeping them both tethered to the fragile promise of survival. When they finally felt solid ground beneath their exhausted bodies, a sense of impossible victory washed over Sarah. Soaked and trembling, she watched the magnificent animal gradually regain its strength. Its black coat, now plastered to its muscular body, shone under the timid rays of sun beginning to break through the clouds, as if nature itself applauded the improbable rescue. The horse remained motionless for a few moments, its heavy breathing slowly calming. Then, in a sudden movement that nearly startled Sarah, it raised its majestic head, fixed its deep eyes on hers for a brief moment, a moment that seemed to hold all the wild wisdom of the world, and then, without looking back, disappeared into the dense vegetation along the bank. It was only when the animal vanished from sight that Sarah allowed herself to collapse onto the mud, her legs finally giving way to the extraordinary effort. Tears mixed with the water still running down her face, but they weren't tears of sadness or relief. They were tears of transformation. For the first time in her career as a nature photographer, she had crossed the invisible line separating observer from participant. She had interfered with the natural course of events, imposed her human will on the seemingly sealed fate of another creature, and nothing would ever be the same. The following weeks passed at an almost feverish pace for Sarah. Unable to forget the transcendent encounter with the black horse, she obsessively dedicated herself to trying to locate him again. Her days began before dawn and ended long after sunset, tirelessly scouring the diverse territories of the basin, her camera always ready to capture that unmistakable silhouette. What initially was just a desire to include the animal in her next photography book gradually transformed into something much deeper. Every conversation with the local ranchers, every story shared around campfires, every glance exchanged with other wild animals crossing her path, everything seemed to lead to a growing revelation she couldn't yet fully name. It was during one of these conversations, under the starry sky that only the remote wilderness can offer in all its magnitude, that an old rancher, with calloused hands and eyes that seemed to hold the ancestral wisdom of the basin, revealed what her heart already suspected. "You didn't just find any horse, ma'am," he said, his rough voice carrying the weight of years and traditions. "You found one of the guardians of the basin." "Guardians of the basin?" The question escaped her almost as a respectful whisper. The old man nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting the dancing firelight. "There are horses in these lands that aren't like the others. They carry the ancient memory of this place in their blood. They know where the waters were long before we got here. They know the secrets the earth holds. They are respected by all animals and feared by those who disrespect the natural balance." "How can I recognize them?" Sarah asked, feeling an inexplicable chill run down her spine. "By the way they look at you," the man replied simply, "as if they can see beyond what you show the world. As if they knew your soul." That night, Sarah barely slept. The old rancher's words echoed in her mind as images of the rescue replayed like a slow-motion film. The black horse's gaze before disappearing into the vegetation. Was there really something different about it? Something that transcended the instinctive gratitude of an animal saved from death? Confirmation of what she had heard came 3 months later, during the annual Basin County Fair. The small town on the riverbank completely transformed at this time of year, attracting visitors and traders from all over the region. Colorful, musical, and vibrant, the fair was a celebration of the local culture in all its forms. Sarah walked among the stalls, absorbing the aromas of local food and the traditional folk tunes mingling with the lively buzz of the crowd, when a storytelling circle caught her attention. Elderly men and women, keepers of the region's oral traditions, shared stories while children and adults listened with reverent attention. And they say that whoever saves a guardian of the basin receives a special blessing. A white-haired woman with a time-worn face narrated with conviction. They become a bridge between our world and the natural world. They begin to understand languages that were once just meaningless noises. Sarah approached timidly, sitting on the edge of the circle, but her presence didn't go unnoticed. A murmur went through the group as someone recognized her and shared whispers of her heroic rescue. Suddenly, she found herself the center of attention, with dozens of gazes that mixed curiosity, admiration, and a strange respect that left her simultaneously honored and uncomfortable. "Is it true you swam against the current to save a black horse during the last flood?" asked a middle-aged man, his eyes shining intensely. Before she could answer, the white-haired woman stood up with surprising agility for her advanced age and approached Sarah, taking her hands. "The hands that touched a guardian," she murmured almost to herself, examining them as if she could read some sign invisible to others. "You carry the mark now." "What mark?" Sarah asked, confused and slightly alarmed. "The mark of responsibility," the elder replied, her eyes fixed on Sarah's with almost hypnotic intensity. "You are no longer alone on your journey. The basin sees you and waits." Those words, spoken with the simplicity of someone announcing an unquestionable truth, sparked an inner revolution in Sarah. Something crystallized within her, as if scattered pieces of a puzzle finally found their correct places, revealing an image that had always been there, just waiting for the right moment to be recognized. The next morning, instead of returning to the big city as originally planned, Sarah made a decision that would permanently alter the course of her life. She extended her stay indefinitely and began the process of establishing a conservation project focused specifically on the region's wild horses. It wouldn't be an easy journey. She immediately faced resistance on several fronts. Local ranchers, whose relationship with wild horses had always been marked by hostility, saw the animals as destructive pests and competitors for scarce resources. "They're just feral horses," they argued dismissively. "Descendants of abandoned domestic animals. They have no special ecological value." On the other hand, the National Park Administration expressed concern about the environmental impact of growing herds. "They aren't native species in the strict sense," explained a conservation biologist during a tense meeting. "They can compete with native herbivores and significantly alter vegetation in sensitive areas." Sarah found herself in a political and ecological minefield, trying to navigate conflicting interests while seeking allies for a cause that, to many, seemed sentimental and scientifically questionable. But something had changed within her. The determination that had always characterized her work as a photographer now found a deeper purpose. It was no longer just about capturing perfect images. It was about protecting a living connection between past and present, myth and reality. Weeks turned into months, and each basin sunrise renewed her conviction. As she mapped the territories of different herds, documenting their habits and interactions with other animals, Sarah began to notice patterns that challenged conventional explanations. The wild horses, particularly herds led by black stallions similar to the one she had saved, seemed to avoid areas about to flood long before any visible sign of danger. In her notes, which grew daily into a compendium of meticulous observations, she recorded, "For the third time this month, the black stallion's herd abandoned a seemingly ideal territory 24 hours before the arrival of a flash flood. Coincidence? Or do they truly possess some kind of perception that transcends our current understanding?" 6 months after the rescue, that changed her life. Sarah ventured into a particularly remote area of the basin. The waters had receded significantly, revealing new paths and previously inaccessible territories. Her small boat glided silently over the mirrored surface of a narrow channel, surrounded by dense vegetation on both sides. The morning tranquility was brutally interrupted when the boat's hull violently struck a submerged log, invisible beneath the murky water. The impact threw Sarah forward, her head hitting the camera gear she carried. For a few seconds, everything went dark. When she fully regained consciousness, the gravity of the situation became clear. The boat was irreparably damaged, water rapidly seeping through the cracked hull. With effort, she managed to paddle to a nearby sandbar, a temporary island formed by the rising and falling waters. The merciless midday sun beat down relentlessly as she assessed her situation. The radio communicator was hopelessly damaged. Her satellite phone, normally kept in a waterproof bag, had disappeared during the impact, likely now resting on the muddy channel bottom. Most of her camera gear, had survived, ironically useless in this circumstance. She had enough water and food for 3 days, maybe 4 if she rationed strictly. She was completely isolated, miles from the nearest town or any common route used by fishermen or ranchers. The temporary island she was on could disappear with the next flood, and predators, mountain lions, coyotes, would surely notice her vulnerable presence sooner or later. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Sarah felt something she had rarely experienced in her adventurous career: genuine fear. Not the calculated fear of professional risk, but the primal dread of being swallowed by the wild vastness she loved to photograph. For the first time, she viscerally understood the difference between admiring nature through the safe lens of a camera and facing its absolute indifference as a fragile, unprotected creature. It was, in this moment of growing desperation, as she prepared a makeshift shelter for the approaching night, that movement in the tree line caught her attention. Her muscles tensed instantly, every sense on high alert. Could it be a mountain lion drawn somehow by the scent of her presence? The silhouette that emerged from the long evening shadows belonged to no predator, but was unmistakably familiar. The black horse, the same one she had rescued months before, now part of a small herd of 5 or 6 animals, partially hidden in the marginal vegetation, watching her with cautious curiosity. "It can't be." The words escaped her in an incredulous whisper. "Is it really you?" As if answering her question, the majestic animal took a few steps forward, separating slightly from the group. Its posture showed no fear or aggression, just attentive awareness and something that, were it human, Sarah would describe as recognition. Slowly, with deliberately gentle movements so as not to frighten him, she stood up. "You remember me, don't you?" she murmured, more to herself than to the animal. Something in the way he watched her, the slight tilt of his head, suggested a memory that challenged conventional expectations about animal cognition. The following minutes unfolded like a lucid dream. The horse began to move parallel to the EO bank, occasionally stopping to look back, as if checking if she was following. Sarah, initially hesitant, felt compelled to accompany him, carrying only her backpack with essential supplies and one camera. The herd guided her for almost an hour, through paths that would be invisible to less attentive eyes, small rises in the seemingly flat terrain, narrow stretches between marshy areas, routes that skirted treacherous sandy patches. Eventually, they reached a clearing where trees grew abundantly, some laden with perfectly ripe fruit. "You brought me to food?" The realization hit her like a wave. Not just food, but by following these specific paths, she realized she now had a much clearer sense of her location and the direction she needed to take to find help. That night, camped in the relative safety of the clearing, with a small campfire warding off the darkness and predators, Sarah contemplated the infinite stars of the basin sky with new eyes. The transcendent encounter had fundamentally transformed her perception of animal intelligence and the complexity of interspecies relationships. The ranchers' stories about the guardians of the basin no longer seemed like mere folk superstitions, but metaphors for a deeper truth that science had yet to fully grasp. The next morning, following the elevated routes she had memorized, she managed to return to civilization. Her return was met with relief and celebration by the small community, which had already begun organizing search parties. However, when she shared the story of how the black horse and its herd had effectively guided her to safety, she was met with mixed reactions, from respectful reverence from the elders to polite skepticism from the younger, more educated residents. "It was probably coincidence," commented a visiting biologist during a community dinner. "The horses were just following their usual routes in search of food, and you interpreted it as deliberate help. Wild animals don't repay favors," added a local veterinarian, though her tone was gentle. That would be attributing human motivations to instinctive behaviors. Sarah just smiled at these comments. Weeks earlier, she herself might have offered similar explanations. Now she held a certainty in her heart that transcended rational arguments, something she had experienced in the exchange of glances with that extraordinary animal, something no scientific paper or academic debate could fully capture. Her return to community life revealed that, during her brief absence, the political landscape had shifted significantly. Her conservation project now faced its greatest threat, an ambitious tourism development proposal promising to transform significant parts of the basin into a luxury resort complex, complete with controlled safaris and carefully orchestrated, authentic experiences for wealthy visitors. "It will bring jobs and progress for all of us," argued the local mayor at a heated community meeting. "We can finally compete with other international destinations and put the American basin on the EBA World Tourism Map." For many residents, the promise of stable jobs and improved basic infrastructure sounded like the solution to decades of government neglect and economic isolation. What few fully understood, or chose to ignore, was that the areas designated for development included precisely the most vital territories for the wild horse herds, especially during the dry seasons. Sarah found herself in a battle requiring very different skills than those she had cultivated as a solitary photographer. Now she needed to be communicator, educator, negotiator, and occasionally a politician. Using the stunning images she had captured during her time with the herd, she created powerful visual presentations illustrating the ecological and cultural importance of the wild horses. "We're not just talking about pretty animals to photograph," she explained at community meetings, schools, and even local churches. "We're talking about creatures that evolved in perfect harmony with this unique ecosystem, who know its cycles and secrets in ways we are only beginning to understand. When we protect the guardians of the basin, we protect the very heart of this land we all call home." Gradually, her words began to resonate. Fishermen shared stories of how the wild horse herds seemed to predict weather changes affecting fish spawning cycles. Family farmers noted that areas frequented by the horses seemed to recover more quickly after natural wildfires. Tour guides realized that visitors were far more deeply moved by unscripted sightings of the majestic animals in their natural habitat than by artificially controlled experiences. A grassroots movement began to form, uniting people who seemingly had little in common beyond their love for the basin, and a growing recognition that there was something special about these animals that transcended their value as mere photographic attractions. 9 months after the initial rescue, just as the conservation movement was finally gaining significant momentum, Sarah faced a devastating personal dilemma. An official letter, stamped with the logo of a prestigious international nature photography agency, brought the offer any professional in her position would consider the pinnacle of her career: an exclusive contract to lead photographic expeditions around the world, documenting threatened ecosystems on every continent. "It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity," commented her best friend during a tense phone call. "The kind of thing you dreamed about since we bought our first cameras together in college." It was true. For years, Sarah had envisioned her success in exactly these terms: international travel, global recognition, access to places few photographers ever reached. It was everything she had always wanted, or at least everything she thought she wanted before a black horse transformed her understanding of purpose and belonging. Accepting would mean abandoning the conservation project at an absolutely crucial moment. Public hearings on the tourism development were scheduled to begin in less than a month. The wild horses' breeding season was approaching, a critical period during which the herds would be particularly vulnerable to disturbance. And something inside her, an intuition growing stronger with each day spent in the basin, insisted she still had an important role to play in this story that began with an impulsive dive into dangerous waters. The following nights were marked by vivid, recurring dreams. In each one, the black horse appeared, sometimes in the distance, other times close enough she could feel his warm breath. There was never a clear narrative or explicit message, just the powerful presence of the animal and a persistent sense of expectation, as if something monumental was about to happen. Dreams are just the brain processing the day's information, she tried to rationalize while watching the basin dawn through her small cabin window. But why did these specific dreams repeat with such consistency and emotional intensity? Why? Did she wake from them with a clarity of purpose that gradually faded as the day wore on? It was during these weeks of inner conflict that the waters began to rise again. earlier and more intensely than predicted by weather forecasters. A combination of exceptional rainfall in the headwaters and changing climate patterns resulted in a flood rapidly approaching record levels. Riverbank communities that normally would have weeks to prepare now faced emergency evacuations. 10 months after her initial encounter with the horse, Sarah was helping with evacuation efforts when an extraordinary phenomenon began to manifest. Herds of wild horses, normally elusive and rarely seen near human settlements, started appearing on the outskirts of the towns most threatened by the flood. Initially, residents greeted their presence with apprehension and confusion, but soon, surprising patterns emerged. The horses seemed to systematically avoid certain areas that, days later, would be the first to be completely submerged. Their paths of movement, observed and mapped by Sarah and a few local volunteers, later proved to be the safest evacuation. Routes avoiding areas prone to landslides or structural collapses. "They're showing us the way," commented an elderly woman, her voice trembling with emotion as she watched a family being guided to safety following the tracks left by a small herd. The guardians are fulfilling their ancient promise. To skeptics, it was just coincidence. The horses were simply following their natural instinct for self-preservation, and any benefit to humans was purely accidental. But for Sarah and a growing number of local residents, it was the living confirmation of stories passed down through generations. The extraordinary event attracted attention far beyond the basin's borders. Journalists arrived, eager to capture the unusual story of the horses that saved a town. More significantly, a group of researchers from the state university set up camp to study the apparently anomalous behavior, bringing academic legitimacy to the observations Sarah had been meticulously documenting. "We're not saying anything supernatural is happening," explained the lead scientist during a televised interview. "But there is clearly a behavioral phenomenon here that warrants rigorous investigation. These animals demonstrate exceptional environmental sensitivity and movement patterns, suggesting a deep knowledge of the terrain and its seasonal variations." The scientist's presence had unexpected and profoundly positive consequences for the conservation movement. What was once seen by many as the sentimental project of a passionate photographer now gained credibility through the scientific community's interest. Funding that previously seemed impossible began to materialize. Authorities who had formerly ignored pleas for wild horse protection now requested reports and consultations. A year after the initial rescue, Sarah published an article combining her personal observations with preliminary data from the ongoing scientific studies, contextualized by local cultural traditions about the guardians of the basin. Initially published in a moderately circulated scientific journal, the article was picked up by larger publications and eventually went viral online, drawing international attention to the basin and its special horses. "What we have witnessed here," she wrote in the article's conclusion, "is not just a fascinating ecological phenomenon, but an invitation to fundamentally reconsider our relationship with other sentient beings sharing our planet." Perhaps the old basin dwellers, by calling these horses guardians, were recognizing a truth our modern science is only beginning to grasp: that protection and preservation are not exclusively human activities, but responsibilities shared by multiple species, each contributing in its own way to the delicate balance that sustains life. The article's success brought new challenges. While public support for the conservation project grew exponentially, it also attracted unwanted attention. Alarming reports began to arrive about poachers and animal traffickers interested in the potential value of the magic horses for private collectors or traditional medicine markets in distant countries. The notoriety that had helped protect the horses now also put them at risk. More worryingly, 18 months after her initial encounter with the black horse, Sarah discovered through an informant in the county office that the tourism development, supposedly under review and reassessment after the public hearings, had been secretly approved through backroom political maneuvers. Construction was scheduled to begin in less than 3 months, deliberately coinciding with the start of the dry season, when local resistance would be logistically harder to organize. "They're hoping the dust settles, literally," the informant explained in a clandestine meeting. By the time the machines arrive, it'll be too late to stop them. The news was devastating, but Sarah was no longer the same person who had arrived in the basin 2 years earlier, armed only with her cameras and professional ambitions. Now she possessed not only detailed knowledge of environmental law and administrative procedures, but also a robust network of allies including respected scientists, environmental lawyers, influential journalists, and most importantly, a local community increasingly engaged in protecting its natural heritage. "They underestimate what we've built here," she said during an emergency meeting with the project's key supporters. "And more critically, they underestimate what these horses truly mean, not just to the ecosystem, but to the cultural identity of this region." Using meticulously documented evidence of irregularities in the approval process and inadequate environmental impact studies, the team managed to obtain a temporary injunction against the start of construction. It was only a partial victory. The legal battle would be long and costly, with appeals and counter-appeals clogging the judicial system for months or even years. But it bought precious time. Time that, as they would soon discover, was the scarcest resource of all. The real test of endurance arrived when an unprecedented drought struck the basin 20 months after the initial rescue. What would normally be a natural, gradual reduction in water levels turned into an acute environmental crisis, with historically low rainfall combined with exceptionally high temperatures. The consequences were devastating for the entire ecosystem. Fish died by the thousands in shrinking, warming pools. Pronghorn, deer, and other herbivores competed fiercely for increasingly scarce vegetation. Spontaneous wildfires, fueled by the parched vegetation, began to break out with alarming frequency, transforming vast areas into lunar landscapes of ash and charred logs. The wild horses suffered especially. Adapted to the natural fluctuations between wet and dry seasons, they weren't prepared for such pronounced extremes. Sarah and her team organized strategic water supply points, but the logistics of keeping these points filled in remote areas, coupled with increasing competition from other equally desperate animals, made the initiative insufficient given the magnitude of the crisis. "We're losing them," Sarah admitted during a video call with the scientific team, now collaborating remotely, unable to return to the field due to the extreme conditions. 3 foals died just last week. The adults are visibly dehydrated and malnourished. If this continues..." She didn't need to complete the sentence. Everyone understood the gravity of the situation. Decades of conservation work could be reversed in a matter of months. Species that had survived natural cycles of abundance and scarcity, for millennia now, found themselves on the brink of collapse due to environmental changes accelerated by human activity. It was when everything seemed most desperate that the reunion occurred. Sarah had gone out at dawn to check one of the most distant water points. The heat was already oppressive, even at that hour, the sky an almost painful blue in its relentless perfection. The landscape that would normally display vibrant greens and blues now presented a faded palette of yellows and browns, like an old photograph overexposed to the sun. In the distance, she spotted a familiar silhouette slowly approaching the water. Point, the black horse visibly thinner, but still carrying an impressive dignity in his posture. Her heart leaped with recognition, but something was different this time. The animal wasn't alone, nor accompanied by his usual herd. Instead, horses from different groups, normally territorial and isolated from each other, followed him in an orderly procession that defied known behavioral patterns. Sarah remained motionless, watching with growing amazement as the black horse led the group not to the water point she had supplied, but to a seemingly arid area a few yards beyond. Reaching a specific spot, he began digging at the ground with his front hooves, a behavior soon imitated by several other animals. "What are they doing?" she murmured to herself, approaching cautiously so as not to disturb the strange collective ritual. The answer came in the form of a tangible miracle. After several minutes of persistent digging, the parched earth began to darken with moisture. Soon, crystal-clear water welled up from the hole that expanded continuously under the animal's coordinated efforts. An underground spring, previously unknown or long forgotten, revealed itself before her incredulous eyes. Later, geologists would explain that changes in the water table caused by the recent extreme floods had altered the course of underground waters, bringing an ancient spring back to life. But how did the horses know exactly where to dig? How had they coordinated their efforts among different, normally separate herds? These questions would remain without definitive answers, fueling both scientific investigations and mythic narratives that would intertwine in the local culture for generations. The event that local residents would come to call the Miracle of the Waters was meticulously documented by Sarah. Her photographs and videos, distributed globally, captured not only the extraordinary moment of the spring's discovery, but also the subsequent scenes of diverse animals, from small rodents to majestic mountain lions, peacefully sharing this new oasis amidst the drought's devastation. The impact was immediate and transformative. International conservationists, previously skeptical about the ecological value of feral horses, now recognize their potential role as keystone species in the basin ecosystem. Government authorities, pressured by public opinion, galvanized by the powerful images, finally agreed to seriously reconsider the development projects threatening the herd's vital territories. Exactly 2 years after the initial rescue, a complete cycle of the basin's seasons, an official sanctuary for the guardians of the basin was inaugurated. The ceremony, combining elements of scientific celebration and cultural reverence, brought together researchers, politicians, community leaders, and hundreds of supporters who had followed the extraordinary journey from its unlikely beginning in the turbulent floodwaters. Sarah, officially appointed as the sanctuary's conservation director, watched the assembled crowd with a mixture of pride and humility. "What we celebrate today," she said in her brief speech, "is not a human victory over nature, but a recognition of our deep interconnection with all forms of life sharing this sacred place. The horses we call guardians don't need us to protect them. They have survived for generations in harmony with this ecosystem. It is we who need them, to remind us of ancient wisdoms we have forgotten and connections we have neglected in our haste to control and modify the natural world." When the formal ceremony ended and the crowd gradually dispersed for the community celebration in the nearby town, Sarah remained alone by the riverbank. The setting sun poured liquid gold over the waters, now restored to their healthy level, painting the landscape with the same vibrant palette that had captured her imagination since she first set foot in the basin. That's when she saw him, the black horse watching from a distance at the edge of the woods. This time, however, he wasn't alone. Beside him, an almost perfect miniature replica, a young foal shared his gleaming black coat and proud stance. Son of the Guardian, born during the most challenging months of the drought, symbolizing the renewal and continuity that have always characterized this resilient ecosystem. What happened next defied everything Sarah thought she knew about animal behavior. With deliberate, dignified steps, the stallion began to approach, gently guiding the foal before him. Stopping just a few feet away, in a demonstration of trust no expert would consider normal for a wild animal, especially one with young, the magnificent creature lowered his head slightly, as if in a solemn nod. Silent tears streamed down Sarah's face as slowly, very slowly, she extended her hand. The foal, after a moment's hesitation and an almost questioning glance at his sire, took the final step separating them. The touch of its soft muzzle against the photographer's trembling fingers felt like an electric current of mutual recognition, a silent pact between species. This transcendent moment captured the essence of everything they had built over the past 2 years. Not just a conservation program or a physical sanctuary, but a new understanding of the relationship between humans and nature in the heart of the basin. A relationship not of domination or mere detached scientific observation, but of mutual respect and coexistence. For Sarah, who had once felt like merely a spectator of wildlife, a documenter of fleeting beauties destined to disappear before the relentless advance of so-called progress, that gentle touch from the wild foal represented more than personal validation. It was a promise for the future, a reminder that the most important stories rarely end. They just transform and continue in new forms, like the basin's own waters in their eternal cycle of rise and fall. As the black stallion and his foal slowly returned to the safety of the growing evening shadows, Sarah remained motionless, recording every detail of that sacred encounter not with her sophisticated cameras, but with the eyes of her awakened heart. Some moments transcend technical documentation and can only be truly preserved in the emotional memory of those privileged enough to witness them. That night, under the starry sky that only the basin can offer in all its cosmic magnitude, Sarah understood that her greatest photograph would never be captured by any lens or printed on any paper. It was the invisible image etched in the collective consciousness of all who had participated in this extraordinary journey. The image of a world where different species recognize and honor the unique wisdom each brings to the great web of life. The wild horse she had once saved from the turbulent waters had returned the favor in ways that transcended any expectation, not just by saving her physical life on that temporary island, but by revealing a purpose and a connection that completely transformed her existence. And through her, touching countless other lives, creating ripples of change that would continue far beyond the visible horizon. As the first stars emerged in the velvet sky, Sarah smiled to herself. The true story of the guardians of the basin, and the photographer who crossed the line between observing and participating, was just beginning. And something in her heart knew, with a certainty transcending rational explanation, that future generations would continue to write new chapters of this eternal story of interconnection, respect, and mutual protection in the wild heart of America.